Hey, I'm Susan Palmer of Lead Cat Press. This is my studio update. Thanks so much for tuning in. These videos are a way for my students to have a reference to material that we went over during the week, and they're also a way for folks who don't know me to be introduced to me and maybe be inspired to take a lesson, a group class, which are all online, or check out my guitar method books. So as always, you can hop down to the description box below to go to the section that most interests you. Our main topic for this week is the blues. And in the technique section, I'll be going over blues scale patterns. For the reading section, I have a book recommendation for you. For the chords, we're going to be applying caged chords to a 12-bar blues, so get you playing all over the neck. For the scales, I'm going to show you how to play chord tones without learning chord tones. For the theory, we're going to play some really compact chords to play over the blues. And for the tune, I've applied those compact chords to a tune called Bag's Blues, Bag's Groove, which is a 12-bar blues, and I've transposed it to the key of C. I also have a pro tip on there, which, I don't know, you're just going to have to watch to see it. Scales are a way of organizing notes into what I call little sonic recipes. And for the blues, there's a lot of different ways that you can organize these notes. So I think a lot of people begin with a minor pentatonic scale pattern, and then they may gravitate towards the blues scale, major pentatonic, mixolydian, chord tones, and some alterations or chromaticism. I've got the scale diagrams for the minor pentatonic, major pentatonic, and blues scale patterns on my website, but I want to walk you through my thought process for creating these blues scale patterns, because that may be something useful for you in terms of these blues scales, but also just in terms of your greater understanding of guitar and how to fret things on guitar. So I'm going to start with a G minor pentatonic scale, and I'm going to play that in a 6-string root. And the G minor pentatonic scale contains these 5 notes. So pentatonic means 5 tones. So we've got G, B flat, C, D, F, and then they just repeat after that. Now the blues scale contains one additional note, which is the flat 5. In the key of G, that would be the note D flat. When I add that to this 6-string root scale pattern, minor pentatonic scale pattern, sounds and looks like this. Easy breezy beautiful. Now for the other remaining scale patterns, something tricky happens because the D flat doesn't fall conveniently under your fingers that are already in the pattern. So you're going to have to step outside of that scale pattern in order to play them. And the process that I use is that if the line is ascending, then I'll use my first finger to reach back and play the note and then come into the next note. And if I'm descending, then I'm going to stretch up with my pinky to play that note. The next G minor pentatonic scale looks and sounds like this. It's a D string root. And we've got 2 Ds in this. This one, the D flat is already conveniently located within that scale pattern. But this D flat, we could play here or there. So when I'm ascending the scale, I'm going to use my first finger. When I'm descending, I'm going to use my pinky. So I've got this. I have to cap that off with that low G there. So that's my thought process. On my website, you'll see the remaining scale patterns notated out there for you. I've got the ascending version and the descending version. So I don't believe that the minor pentatonic scale with that flat 5, otherwise known as the blues scale, is the be-all end-all for playing over the blues. But I do think this is an important thing for guitar players to learn about and kind of start to establish how you want to fret these different notes. What is your thought process going to be on these? This week I have a book recommendation for you that is not the Guitar Lesson Companion Volume 1. It's actually a book called Blues Scales by Dan Greenblatt, and I'll put the link in the description box below. I like this book for many reasons. One is that it has what I call little starter riffs for your blues solos. And if you know how to read music, then you could read through those. If you don't know how to read music, well, I think you know the book that I would recommend that you study before getting this book. But anyways, I'm going to play a couple of these riffs just so you get kind of a feel for it and see how cool this stuff is. So that's one. So it's just little ideas like that. So you can just open up the book and grab these very short ideas. And they're all, they're just very well presented and very easy to understand. The other thing that I like about this book is it offers a bridge between playing minor pentatonic scales or blues scales or major pentatonic scales and to getting to chord tones. So I really stress in my teaching, I have students learn their blues scales and their minor pentatonics, major scales, and then we get to chord tones. And that's a strategy that works really well for me and a lot of my students who just want to make that leap. So I've got a little course that I take them through. But if you, this offers kind of a bridge between that. And I really like the way that he presents this alternative idea. So if you're looking for either some blues starter riffs or, you want to check out this other system, I'd recommend the Blues Scales book by Dan Greenblatt. I consider myself very lucky because our high school had a jazz band. And while I didn't really like waking up at 5 in the morning every day, I really did enjoy playing music every single day that I had to go to school. It was kind of an incentive to get to school on a lot of days. And one of the things that we did to begin class is we would play a blues and everybody got to take a solo. So as a guitar player, that meant that I had to play like 30 choruses of chords before I even got to my solo. And there was another guitar player. His name is Dr. Capital. He's on Instagram and YouTube and all that. Fantastic player. He was then, he is now. Go check him out. And so we would trade back and forth, but it's still challenging of, playing that many choruses through a song. And one thing that I started doing is, I remember when I was working on my caged chords, and I just decided that I was going to play the blues in 5 different places on the neck, just with those chords. And so at first, I practiced just all of my C7s. So I started with a C shape, then an A shape, then a G shape, an E shape, and a D shape. And I would just, I had a backing track I'd make, or, I'd just kind of screw around. And then I started working on my F chords. So my first F7 is down here, but I really don't like this F7. It's just too hard to avoid that high E string, which really clashes. So I use a concept that I call the old switcheroo, where I exchange the note F on the low E string for the F on the high E string, and I just modify my fingering around, and I kind of like how that sounds down there. So I have this E string root, F7, then the D string root, F7, and then the C shape or B string root, F7, the A string root, F7, the G string root, F7, and then if I'm feeling really wild, there's another F7 up here, which is just the repeat of this one. And then I would practice the G7 chord. So down here, here's my G string root, G7. Then I have an E string root, G7. Then I have D string root, G7, C shape or B string root, G7, A string root, G7. So now that I've got all of those chord shapes worked out, I can play a 1-4-5 chord progression in each one of those places. And I'm just going to show you where those all are, and I encourage you to play with the backing track. I got the links down below. So if C7 is here, my lowest place, then my next closest F7 will be right here, and my closest G7 is right here. If I'm playing C7 here, I've got F7, I've got this G7 or that one, depending on if I want to do that old switcheroo. Here's my C7 in the G shape, then I've got an F7 here and a G7 here. I've got C7, F7, G7, C7, F7, G7, and you get the picture. So then I just would, I would start when we started our class, playing down here, and this is assuming we were playing a blues in C. I'm not sure if we played a blues in C, if it was a different key, but I like showing students this in C because it's easier for us. So I would play my first, the first soloist would play, and I would play my chords down here. The next one would usually alternate to my friend, Dr. Capital. He would play, and then it would come back to me, and I would have some time to think about what those next chord shapes were going to be. And so for the next time I got to comp behind somebody, I would play here. And then he would comp, and then when it came back to me, I had been able to work out, where my next time was that I was playing. So I had a great opportunity to really learn this stuff and apply it right away, first thing in the morning, which is a great way to play the blues. I want to go over another way to think about soloing over the blues. And as you know, I teach all of my students chord tones. That's a really important process that we go through. It's very rigorous. It's what Volume 2 is all about. But I want to show you something I do in between minor pentatonic scale patterns and chord tones. And that is to visualize the chord shapes in the minor pentatonic scale. So let's say you know your E string root C minor pentatonic scale, and you also know your C dominant chord right here. So I'm doing an E string root, and then you've got an A string root F7 and a C shape or a B string root, even though it also has its root note on the low A string. Think of that as a C shape chord for your G7 chord. Now, if you can keep in your mind this scale pattern, this minor pentatonic scale pattern, that just gives you kind of the general lay of the land and some of those cool kind of bluish sounding notes. And you can also kind of imagine where those chord shapes fall. You can actually make a quite cohesive solo using chord tones. You don't even have to know the names of the notes. If you can visualize those chords, you're playing the right stuff. So some of those notes are really going to sing. And I found that this is just a really nice way to help students really get the sound of chord tones, and it kind of tells me if they're actually hearing those notes. So with that in mind, you might sound something like this. So I can't do it. I can't stop thinking of the note name. So I played a little bit out of those patterns there. All right, let me give it another try. I'm going to stick to these chord tones for C7, these for F7, these for G7, although I will step outside of that a little bit. All right, there you go. A proper solo, really utilizing these shapes. It is hard for me to do because I know the notes on the neck and I know their functions. So I'm seeing the chord shapes, but I'm also using my ear and kind of wanting to go in different directions. But that's a good way to get you started. Here's some quick music theory for you. When you're playing your C7 with an E string root, your F7 and G7 in a C shape or B string root, you're playing your thirds and sevens on the D string and the G string. So for the C7 chord, you can see I'm playing B flat and E. For the F7 chord, I've got A and E flat. And then for the G7 chord, I've got B and F. So that means that this is your C7 chord, there's your F7 chord, and there's your G7 chord. Keeping in mind that those thirds and sevens are the most important notes in the chord. And besides being cool on the guitar, it can also be very helpful because if you're playing with a keyboard player who's just taking up a lot of space, or maybe another guitar player, or if you're soloing a single note solo and you want to punctuate your solos with chords, these chord shapes don't take up a lot of room. So you can play solo and punctuate your ideas, or you can use these shapes when you're playing in a band and you're not going to get in anyone's way. I'm going to apply that concept of the threes and sevens to a tune called Bag's Groove. I'm playing it in C, and I'm going to interpret the metronome as being on the 2 and the 4. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. My pro tip for you this week is to learn and play the blues in all 12 keys. And in the description box, I've got the links to the jam tracks, and you'll see the chords scrolling by, so you have no excuse. But think about it. If you learned one key per week, then in 3 months, you will have played through and hopefully memorized all 12 keys for the blues. That's going to unlock a lot of different patterns for chords and scales and melodic ideas, but it's also going to train you to transpose other songs into keys that may come up. So it's a really good process. And the blues is one of the foundational elements of music. So give it a shot.